This year, beginning of this year, my star word was solitude. Now, those of you who don't know what a star word is, we every year in January, right around the time of Epiphany, we have what we call Star Gift Sunday. And we have these stars kind of representing the Magi who came to visit Jesus, but we have these stars and they have a word on them. And that word is randomly selected, that star with a word on it is randomly selected by members of our church, and as well as visitors, because we put this online as well. Anyway, you draw this word, and this word is supposed to somehow come to life to you during the year. And so my star word was solitude. And from the time that I got that star word, I thought that was really interesting, because I've really been trying to quiet myself more, to give myself time to just listen for God's voice, to really just spend time of mindfulness, where I become aware of where God is in my life, the presence of God, and how God's leading me. So solitude has been a great word for me so far this year. But you know, something has occurred to me while I've been seeking what it means to find solitude. And what occurred to me is this: I can quiet myself. Okay, I can put myself in my room where I can be all by myself and there's no distractions around me. I can come to a place like this and I can sit in quiet solitude. So I can do things to quiet the outside things that are going on in my life or around me. But sometimes it's harder to quiet what's going on inside of me. Finding that internal solitude is part of what I think many of us really struggle with. I mean, we can find a way to shut ourselves off from the noise from the outside, but how do we quiet the noise that's going on inside of us? While I was thinking about this, I also happened upon a devotional that was talking about the difference between guilt and shame. And so as I looked at this and read kind of what the difference was, the author was using the story of Adam and Eve and the story of when they first sinned in the garden. So there's a story in Genesis about Adam and Eve being placed in the garden and God telling them, do not eat of this one tree. You can eat of anything else, but don't eat of this one tree. And if you are familiar with the story, of course, you know that they did eat from the tree, and that was called original sin. It was the story of how sin enters into the lives of humanity and the lives of humankind. But as I went on reading this devotional, the author was talking about how we talk about that as the origin of sin, but in reality, it was the origin of shame. And he goes on to talk about the difference. He says guilt is over something. When I feel guilt, he says, that means I'm feeling something over something I've done or I haven't done. That's what guilt is. He said, but shame is really a primary emptiness of our very being. So he said shame has to do with us just not being comfortable with who we are. Guilt is over something we did or didn't do, but shame has to do with how we see this making us or clouding us. This is becoming who we are. This is shame. And when we feel shame, we don't so much make excuses like we may feel when we feel guilty. When we feel shame, we really begin to completely hide ourselves, completely close ourselves off. And I think that creates a noise within us that says, you're not good. You're not worthy. God really doesn't love you. The things that you have done are so awful that it has affected who you are to the place where you can't see yourself in relationship with God. So how do you find solitude if that's going on inside of you? What's interesting about this story is right after in the story where Adam and Eve have done what God told them not to do, they notice or they see that they're without clothes, they're naked. And so they hide themselves from God. And this is out of guilt, but it's also out of shame, because I don't want you to see me anymore, because who I am is not worthy to be in your presence. And it's interesting because right after this, God calls them out of hiding and then tells them that as a result of what they did, they've got to live by those results, and life is not going to be easy for them. God does not punish them per se. I think what God does is God says, now you've got to play out your life given your choice. But then, in chapter 3, where this story is told, towards the end of that chapter, it talks about how the man named his wife Eve, and she became the mother of all living things. But then it goes on to say this, and I think this is a really cool line. This is Genesis chapter 3, verse 21. It says, "And then God made garments of skin for the man and for his wife, and he clothed them." And again, the author of this devotional I was reading said, God gave them a way to cover their shame. God took their shame away from them. You know, in order for us to enter into God's presence, we have to realize the love that God has for us. It's so often we are so focused on the things we feel guilty of, the things we feel shameful for, that we can never draw into God's presence. Not because God doesn't want to be there with us, not because God isn't there with us, but because we, in our own shame, continue to push God out. So, perhaps we all need to seek some sense of solitude in our life. And yes, finding a quiet place like this is a great first step. But finding a way to allow God to cover your shame, to clothe you and let you know that you are God's child. There's no other way to solitude but recognizing, accepting that truth.